My name is Dorothée Arsenault, and I am 81 years old, and I have not told this story to anyone living except my nephew Gilles, who has promised to say nothing until I am in the ground and cannot be asked to explain myself. I am recording this because Gilles' daughter Martine asked me last spring whether it was true, what her father had whispered to her once when she was small, that her great-aunt had been a search and rescue volunteer in 1968 and had found a woman living underground and refused to bring the report back correctly. Martine is 34 now. She is a doctoral student at the Université de Montréal studying boreal ecology, and she looks at me with the particular patience of someone who has been trained to observe rather than to conclude. When she asked me, there at my kitchen table with the afternoon light coming in through the window above the garden, I thought very clearly that if anyone in this family deserved the truth, it was her. So I told Gilles I wanted to make a recording. He set up a small device on the kitchen table. He said he would leave me alone, and he did, and the house has been quiet for 2 hours now while I have gathered myself. I should say at the start that I was 39 years old in September of 1968, and I had been a registered nurse for 15 years, and I had been a volunteer with the Provincial Search and Rescue Unit for 7 of those 15 years, based out of Septiles on the north shore of the St. Lawrence. I say this not to establish my credentials, though they are real, but to say that I was not a woman who imagined things or embellished them. I had delivered children in houses without heat. I had carried men out of the forest on improvised litters, with their legs wrapped in canvas and their faces grey with cold. I understood the difference between what I had witnessed and what I had supposed. I still do. The woman's name was Vivienne Corriveau. She was 31 years old. She had been reported missing by her brother, a pulp cutter named Sylvain Corriveau, on the 14th of July, 1968, after she failed to appear at a family gathering in Havre-Saint-Pierre. The search had been listed as open and suspended for 6 weeks before our unit was asked to make one final sweep of the karst terrain on the ridge north of the Mécatina River, approximately 40 kilometers inland from the highway. The geology there is unusual for that part of Quebec, a limestone shelf left exposed by glacial recession over many thousands of years, shot through with fissures and cave systems that the provincial survey had never fully mapped. There had been one serious mapping attempt in 1954 by a university team from Laval, but they had gotten only 2 kilometers into the main gallery system before equipment failures and early snowfall turned them back, and their notes had never been followed up. I want to be precise about the date, because it matters to what I am going to tell you. We went in on the 18th of September, 1968. There were 4 of us. Myself, a man named Fernand Gobet, who was a 51-year-old forester and the unit's best tracker. A young constable named Théodore Vachon, who had been assigned to give us official presence, and a volunteer named Madeleine Côté, who was 26 years old and had the steadiest nerves of any person I have ever worked beside. We had been told by the provincial authorities that the search was almost certainly a recovery mission now, that Vivienne Corriveau had been missing 66 days, and that no one lost in that terrain survived 66 days without resupply. We understood our task to be documentation rather than rescue. We went in prepared for documentation. We drove north from Septiles on a logging road that ended at a locked gate, and then we walked the remaining 11 kilometers to the ridge on a track that Fernand knew from his work in the area. The trees changed as we climbed, the mixed forest of the valley giving way to black spruce and jack pine as the ground rose and thinned, the soil growing pale and stony underfoot. And by the time we reached the limestone shelf in the late afternoon of the first day, the trees had shortened and spread themselves more widely apart, as though even they understood that the rock beneath would not support excess. We made camp at the base of the ridge and ate and said very little to each other, the way you say very little before a task whose nature you are still determining. Fernand found the entrance on the second day. It was a vertical crack in the limestone shelf, no wider than a man's shoulders at the top, widening below into what his light showed as a descending passage. We gathered at the lip and looked down into it, and it was very dark beyond the first few meters, and smelled of cold stone and deep earth, and the kind of moisture that has not seen sunlight in a long time. There were marks on the rock at the lip. At first I thought they were nothing, weathering or lichen, and then I crouched and looked more carefully, and I saw that the limestone had been smoothed along the left edge, smoothed in a long, even line from about 2.5 feet above the entrance to about 4 feet above it, as though something very large had gripped that edge repeatedly over a long period of time. And the smoothing was pale and bright against the older grey of the rock, which meant it was recent, which meant it had been made within the last season, or perhaps less. Fernand saw it the same moment I did. He showed it to Theodore with a tilt of his chin, and Theodore was young enough to write it down in his notebook without yet understanding what he had written. The width of the smoothed band, the height of it above the entrance, those were the measurements of a grip belonging to something substantially larger than any person. We descended in pairs, in. Fernand went first with Madeleine, and I followed with Theodore, and the passage opened within 8 meters into a gallery roughly 4 meters wide and 3 meters high, running roughly northwest by the compass. Our lights were good. Fernand had brought carbide lamps as backup to the electric torches, and he had thought to bring extra carbide, which proved to be the preparation that made the difference over the next 36 hours. The floor of the gallery was damp, and in certain places there was a thin skim of silt that held impressions. And I will not describe those impressions in detail, except to say that Fernand stopped walking when he saw them, and turned to look at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in 7 years of working beside him. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had been a forester in the Boreal for 30 years, and he had calibrated himself accordingly against most of what the northern forest offered. The expression I saw was not fear, but was the look of a man doing a very rapid recalculation of the parameters of a situation he had thought he understood. We went on. The gallery branched twice, and Fernand chose the right branch each time, because the air was moving there. A current coming from the right that was warmer than what came from the left, and where there is warmth in a cave there is either water or living things, and he wanted to find the source of it. The limestone walls caught the light of our lamps and threw it back in strange facets, and in certain places where the walls were wet, the reflections moved as though the stone itself were breathing. We heard her before we saw her. A cough, once, quiet and controlled, the cough of someone who has been suppressing coughs and occasionally fails. Then silence, then the sound of something settling, a small, careful movement that suggested a person who had learned to be very still. Madeleine said her name quietly, Vivienne, and then again, a little more carefully. Vivienne Corriveau, we are search and rescue. We mean no harm to anyone in this place. There was a long pause, long enough that I thought perhaps we had heard water after all, or some animal in the passages above us. The limestone dripped somewhere ahead of us, a slow, even sound, and the lamp flames bent slightly in the current from the right passage. Then a voice came in a register so low and careful that I had to hold my breath to catch it. She said she knew what we were. She said she needed us to understand something before we came any further. Fernand stopped walking. We all stopped walking. I was the senior member of the team and the only medical professional, and so I moved forward and answered for the group. I told her my name. I told her I was a nurse. I told her she had been missing since July, and that her brother Sylvain was the person who had asked us to search. A pause. She said that Sylvain would want her to come out. I said yes, that he was very worried. She said she knew he was. She was sorry for that. But she needed me to tell her one thing first. She asked whether, when we came down into the cave, when we were at the entrance, we had seen marks on the stone, on the left side of the lip. I told her I had seen them. She said that then we already knew she was not alone here. I want to say something about the silence that followed those words, because it was a particular kind of silence, shaped by the fact that all four of us were registering the same implication at the same moment and choosing, each in our own way, not to name it aloud. Theodore shifted behind me, and the sound of his boot on the stone was very loud. Madeleine's lamp cast our shadows long and strange on the gallery wall, 4 shadows that stretched and merged into a single darkness at the edges of the light. Fernand did not move. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading the boreal forest for the signs of what lived in it, and I have always believed that he understood what those marks at the entrance meant before any of the rest of us did, and that the stillness he held in that moment was not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of a man being very deliberate about not making an error. I said we were not there to harm anything in that place. We were there to understand her situation, and we would not do anything without telling her first. She said that was exactly what she needed to know. She asked for a moment. She came to us then. Her lamp appeared first, a small oil lamp in a clay basin that she held low, and to one side the flame yellow and steady in the still air, and then her face appeared above it. She was thinner than her photograph, but not terribly so. Her clothing was layered and heavy, wool over canvas over flannel, and she wore a pair of men's work boots stuffed with dried moss to fill the extra space. She had a way of moving that I recognized immediately from my years in hospital wards, the deliberate economy of a person who has been living with cold for a long time and has learned to move in a way that wastes nothing. She was also, and I say this without embellishment, entirely at peace. Whatever I had expected to find in that gallery after 66 days, I had not expected a woman who looked at us with the settled calm of someone who had been mildly interrupted in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and was deciding how to receive the interruption with appropriate courtesy. She asked us to come and sit with her. She said she had food such as it was. She led us to her camp, which occupied a section of the gallery where the floor widened and was flatter, perhaps 50 meters further along the right branch. The camp was organized with the neatness of someone who has made a long study of limited space. Her bedroll was wool, 3 blankets layered with a waterproof canvas beneath. She had a section of the wall she was using as a shelf, with objects arranged on natural ledges in the limestone. A small knife, a tin cup, a length of cord, a collection of dried plants she had identified and gathered, a cloth bag that held her remaining dry food. At the center of the camp, she had a wick lamp made from a small clay pot she had shaped herself, and over it she had suspended a second, larger pot from a projection in the limestone, and in the pot there was a broth of mushrooms and something else, very dark, that smelled of earth and depth. She poured portions into tin cups, her own single cup and 3 additional ones she produced from a wooden box she had lashed together from bark and cord. She offered a cup to each of us before she said another word. Madeleine accepted first, and she accepted without hesitation, and she drank without making any face about what the broth tasted like, and I will remember that moment for as long as I am able to remember anything. What Madeleine understood, and what the rest of us took a moment longer to understand, was that accepting what a person offers is itself a form of testimony, that you receive what someone gives you, and in receiving it, you say something without speaking that words are too slow to say as cleanly. She was 26 years old, and she had understood something that most people take decades to learn, if they learn it at all. I accepted my cup and drank. It was warm and rich, and I felt the warmth settle through my chest and stay there. Vivian sat across from us and looked at each of us with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who has been alone for a long time and is relearning how to read faces. She said she would tell us everything. She needed us to understand it before we decided what to do. She had gone into the forest on the 4th of July, not the 14th when her brother had reported her missing, because she had not told anyone she was going, and Sylvain had not realized for 10 days that she was not simply avoiding company, which she had been doing with some regularity since Gaëtan died. Her husband, Gaëtan Corriveau, had been lost to a sawmill accident in the summer of 1966, a catastrophic and sudden death that left her alone in the house they had built together at the edge of Havre-Saint-Pierre, with 2 years of firewood stacked by the back door, and his boots still inside it, and his coat on the hook beside it. She had spent those 2 years in a grief that she described to us not as pain exactly, but as a kind of gravity, a relentless pull downward that she had eventually stopped fighting, because fighting it cost more than she had. She had stopped sleeping regular hours and started sleeping when exhaustion took her. She had stopped eating at a table and started eating over the kitchen sink. The house had felt, she said, like a room someone had left in the middle of a sentence, and she had been waiting for 2 years for the sentence to be finished, and had finally understood it never would be. She had gone into the boreal the way many people go, which is because the forest does not offer condolences and does not require you to perform improvement. It goes on doing what it does regardless of your presence or your grief, and the indifference of it is, in the right season, a relief. She had found the cave entrance on her 3rd day in, climbing the karst ridge in the early morning with no particular purpose except to see what was on the other side of it. She had found the crack in the limestone and felt the warmth rising from below, and climbed down into the gallery, out of curiosity and, she said honestly, because the gallery felt like somewhere she could simply be. She had made a small camp near the entrance in the first 2 days. On the second night, while she was sitting with her lamp burning low to conserve the oil, something had come into the gallery from the deeper passages. She stopped here and looked at each of us in turn, measuring something. She said she could not tell us what it was because she did not know what to call it, and still did not. She knew what it was not. It was not a bear. She knew bears, knew their sound and their smell, and the space they occupied in the dark. This was none of those things. It moved on 2 legs, and it was very large, and it moved in the passage with the unhurried ease of something that had been moving in that passage its entire life, in the way a person moves through the rooms of a house they have lived in for 40 years, without thinking about where anything is. When it entered the gallery, it saw her and stopped, she said. It did not make a sound of alarm. It did not retreat. It lowered itself very slowly to a crouch so that its face was closer to the level of hers, and it remained in that crouch for what she estimated was 10 minutes without moving and without making any sound. And she remained still as well, partly because she was not certain her legs would carry her, and partly because she understood, in a way that bypassed language entirely, that it was showing her something, that it was demonstrating with its body that it was not frightened of her, and it was waiting to learn whether she was frightened of it. She had exhaled, and that was all she did, she said. She let out the breath she had been holding, and it made a sound in response, low and resonant, coming from somewhere deep in its chest, the kind of sound that you feel as a vibration in the stone floor before your ears process it as sound at all. And after that, she stayed. I have thought about that sentence for nearly 60 years. I have turned it over in the dark of many nights, and I have never been able to improve on it, or find a more honest way to say the same thing. She stayed. She said it as though it were the most natural conclusion available, as though Anyone presented with those exact circumstances would have made the same decision, and perhaps she was right. And the only reason the rest of us would have climbed back out into the light is that we had not been sitting inside a gravity so complete that the ordinary inducements to return, warmth and human faces, and the routines of a life had spent years losing their persuasive power. She moved her camp deeper into the gallery over the following week, to the spot where we were now sitting. The creature had not interfered with her camp and had not approached it directly, but on the third morning after she established herself there, she had woken to find a pile of dried mushrooms arranged in a line on a flat stone at the edge of the camp. 8 mushrooms, arranged with a specificity she recognized as intentional. On the 4th morning, there was a cluster of dried berries beside the mushrooms, purple-black crowberries by their shape. On the 5th morning, there was a portion of dried meat, cleaned and odorless, set on a flat piece of bark. She had eaten all of it because she was hungry, and because the offerings were exactly what they appeared to be. The extension of a hospitality she recognized from her own upbringing in a family where care was expressed most naturally through provision rather than through words. I am a nurse, and I have been trained in the discipline of observing rather than explaining. And I have found over a long career that those two activities are not only different, but are frequently in direct conflict, because the reach for explanation has a way of closing down what observation has opened up. I say this because what I saw in that gallery over the next 30 hours is something I have never been able to explain, and I stopped trying to explain it within the first year after we came out. Since then, I have been content to carry what I observed without the weight of an explanation attached to it. The creature came while we were sitting with Vivian, while the second round of carbide was burning in Fernand's lamp. It came from the northwest passage, the deeper one, and it came without announcement, and it stopped at the edge of the lamp's reach, and remained there. Fernand made a sound. Very small, the barely audible intake of breath of a man who has just completed a calculation and understood its result. Madeline did not move at all. I have always thought that was her finest hour. Theodore made a motion toward his belt, and Vivian said, without raising her voice or changing its quality in any way, without urgency, she said, "Please do not do that." And Theodore did not do it. He was 24 years old, and he was very frightened, and he had every reason not to listen to a woman he had known for 3 hours. And he listened, and I am grateful to him for it, because there are things that are more true than the procedures you are trained in, and occasionally you have to trust someone who is closer to the truth than you are. The creature was enormous. I will not pretend that the size was not the first thing I registered, because it was. It stood in the bent-forward crouch it maintained to fit the gallery's ceiling at an estimated height of 9 feet, perhaps more. Its shoulders were broad in the way that very old trees are broad, suggesting not mass assembled recently, but mass accumulated over enormous time. It was covered in fur the colour of deep river silt after rain, nearly black in the lamp's light, with a deep reddish-brown where the light caught the outer edges. Its hands were open and held slightly forward in the crouch, wider than dinner plates, with dark, thick nails that had the look of things grown slowly over decades rather than months. Its face was the face of something very old. I mean that in the most specific way I can. It was not young, and the age in it was not dereliction, but accumulation. The lines and heaviness of a face that had processed a great deal of time. It had brow ridges that cast its eyes in shadow, but the eyes were not in shadow when it turned its head, and the lamp caught them. And what the lamp caught was not the flat, reflective shine of an animal's tapetum, but something darker and more considered. A depth of looking that I have only otherwise seen in the faces of very old people who have arrived at a kind of peace with their lives and are looking at the world from inside that peace, rather than from any remaining urgency. It looked at each of us in turn, not a sweeping glance, but a deliberate settling of attention on each face, one at a time, in the way that a person looks at strangers when they are deciding what the strangers mean and what weight to give their presence. It spent what I estimated as 30 seconds on each face. When it reached mine, I had the clear sensation of being assessed by something genuinely curious about what I was, not in a threatening way, but in the way of an intelligence encountering something unfamiliar and applying itself carefully to the question. Then it looked at Vivian. What happened between them in that look I cannot describe, because it was not in any language that description applies to. I can tell you that her face changed when she looked back at it, that some of the careful composure she had maintained since we arrived relaxed slightly, the way a face relaxes in the company of someone before whom composure is not required. And I can tell you that it held the look for a long moment before it made the sound she had described to us, the low, resonant sound from deep in its chest. And then it withdrew back into the Northwest Passage with the same unhurried silence with which it had arrived. Vivian looked at us. She said we could see now why she could not leave. What followed was the conversation I have been assembling in my memory for 56 years, trying to get the order right. I know we talked for several hours because Fernand's second carbide filling burned out before we finished, and he had to refill it a third time. Theodore said almost nothing the entire time. I credited that to wisdom then, and I still credit it to wisdom, though it may have been both wisdom and the recognition that he had arrived at the edge of what his training could tell him, and the only honest posture available was attention. She told us she had come to understand certain things about her companion over the weeks of living in the gallery. She used that word, companion, without apparent self-consciousness, and none of us found reason to object to it. She believed the creature was singular in this system. She had explored the passages over many days, carefully, never going so far that she could not find her way back, and the evidence of the passages suggested one inhabitant, not a family or a group, and she believed it had been living alone in these chambers for a very long time. The wear patterns on the stone in the main passage were deep and consistent, worn by the same weight, moving in the same directions for years she could not begin to estimate. She believed it was old for reasons similar to those I had already observed independently in the short time I had watched it move. The way it carried itself in certain lights had the quality she associated with age and with pain that has been long accommodated. It favored its left side. It lowered itself slowly when it crouched and rose slowly when it stood, and there was a particular set to its left shoulder that she had seen before, she said, in patients who were living with an old injury that had healed imperfectly and taught the body to compensate. She believed it was not well. She said this very quietly, with a care that told me she had been holding this knowledge for some time and had not found a way to make it lighter. She believed it was losing weight, even over the time she had been there. There was something in the deeper passages it still found, still brought back, but less than there had been in the first weeks, and it rested more. She did not think it would survive another winter in that place alone. Fernand asked in the careful, quiet way of a man who asks only questions he actually needs answered, how she knew it needed her. She said she was the only one who knew where it was. She meant this in the plainest possible sense, which was also the truest sense. She was not speaking about loneliness or longing, though I think those things were present on both sides of the lamplight. She was speaking about the fact that a living thing alone in the dark is alone, in part because the world outside does not know it is there, and when someone finally knows, the knowing changes the situation in both directions. Fernand nodded. He said nothing more. I have thought many times about that nod, about what he was agreeing to, And I think what he was agreeing to was the logic of the situation, which was complete and which left us with a choice that was not really a choice, so much as a test of what we each believed about the relative weight of different kinds of obligation. It was Madeline who said the thing that settled it, though she would not have described herself as settling anything. Without particular emphasis, as though she were reporting an observation she had been making for a while and had only just arrived close enough to articulate, she said she had once had a dog that was dying, and she had sent the dog away for a week because her sister needed help moving house. And when she came back, the dog had died, and the kennels man told her the dog had stopped eating the second day she was gone. She said this into the middle of the silence, and then she was quiet, and none of us said anything, and Theodore looked at the floor of the gallery, and Fernand looked at his hands, and I looked at Vivian. We stayed one more night. The gallery floor was cold stone, and our sleeping equipment was not intended for overnight use, and Theodore did not sleep at all that I could tell. But nothing happened in the night that was alarming. The creature returned once, sometime in the deep middle of the night, when the lamps were low and I was lying awake, working through a decision. It crossed the gallery from the northwest passage toward the southeast, which was a shorter route than the one it had used when we first saw it, and it passed within 10 meters of where we lay. And it paused briefly as it passed Vivian's bedroll, a pause of perhaps 10 seconds, and made a sound so low and resonant that it entered my body through the stone floor before it entered my ears through the air. Then it went on, and the gallery was silent. In the morning, Fernand went through the deeper passages for 2 hours with his carbide lamp, and came back to the camp and ate the last of his food, a piece of hard cheese and some dried meat. And then he said there was another way out. About 300 meters northwest, he said, a vertical shaft that emerged on the ridge above the main system, with natural footholds that were rough enough to hold, not cut, but reliable. She could get herself out that way without any equipment. He said it to all of us, but he was looking at Vivian. She said she knew about the shaft. We left in the late morning of the 19th. We climbed the entrance passage with the ropes we had brought and emerged into September sunlight that felt, after the gallery's lamp-coloured dark, very large and very indifferent. I stood at the lip of the entrance and looked out over the ridge toward the river valley, and held my report in my mind and went through it the way I had been trained to do, asking myself whether I could make it true. I could not make it true. The report said a search of karst terrain along the north ridge of the Mekatina River watershed had been conducted on September 18th and 19th by a team of 4, that all accessible gallery systems had been entered and examined, that no evidence of any human presence had been discovered, and that the search was closed and the file archived. Every word of it was a lie. I wrote it in the clean, careful handwriting I used for patient charts, at the desk in the unit office in Septil, with a cup of coffee growing cold at my elbow, and I submitted it to the provincial coordinator on the 21st of September, and I signed my name to it in the full knowledge of what I was doing, and my hand did not shake. Theodore signed it too. He came into the office on the 22nd, and I placed the form in front of him, and he read it from top to bottom, and he did not look at me when he signed, but he signed it, and then he put the pen down and stood there for a moment and said he was going to get a coffee. And he left the room. He was 24 years old, and he had not yet settled into whatever kind of man he was going to become. And I believe, looking back over the years I watched him work, that the signing of that form was one of the things that shaped what he became, which was a man who understood that the letter of a thing and the truth of it are not always the same, and that choosing between them when you are forced to choose requires you to know which one you trust more. He became a good man. I watched it happen over the 14 years we worked in the same unit, slowly, in accumulated dispositions rather than single moments, in the quality of attention he brought to the work, in the way he spoke to people who were frightened and to people who were in the aftermath of loss. He retired in 1986 and moved to Baie-Comeau, and I spoke with him by telephone last spring. He said he had not forgotten anything about that trip. I told him I was making a recording. He said that was good, that it deserved to be remembered, whatever it was. Fernand never spoke of it to me directly. He was a man who expressed his understanding through action rather than through language, and he had given his action in the gallery when he went alone into the northwest passages and came back and reported, accurately, that there was a second way out of the system, and after that, he did not need to say anything further. He retired in 1971 and moved to his wife's family's land above Blanc-Sablon. I visited him twice before he died in 1984. We talked about the weather and his sheep, and a man we had both worked with in the early 60s who had been recognized by the province for survey work. We did not discuss September of 1968, and the absence of the discussion was not the absence of the thing, but its presence, in the particular quality of silence that existed between us whenever the conversation moved near that region of our shared experience and then moved quietly away. Madeleine Côté became my closest friend in the years that followed, closer than I had realized she was becoming until I found, sometime in the late 1970s, that she was the person I called first when something happened that I needed to think about aloud. She was the godmother of my nephew, Gilles. She died in June of 1991 of a cancer that was swift and thorough, and in the last weeks of it, when there was nothing left to conserve and the conversation had arrived at the place where only true things were worth saying, she told me that, in the spring of 1969, she had gone back to the ridge alone, in the mud season when the road was barely passable, and had found the entrance and climbed down. She said the gallery was empty. Not abandoned in the sense of having been left in disorder, but empty in the way a room is empty when someone has taken care, before leaving, to leave it properly. Vivian's camp equipment was gone. The clay pots were gone. The flat stone where the mushrooms had been arranged was bare and clean. The floor had been swept, or something equivalent to swept, and the space had the quality of a room in which a person has settled their affairs and departed with intention. Madeleine sat in the empty gallery for a while with her carbide lamp, and then she climbed back out into the spring light and sat on the limestone shelf and let the sun be on her for a while before she went back down the ridge. She said she did not know whether Vivian had left because the creature had died or because it had recovered. She was glad not to know, she said. Either answer was a kind of closing, and she preferred to carry the open question rather than a closed answer, because the open question had more room in it, more room for the thing to go on, being whatever it had been rather than being sealed into one of two possible endings. Vivienne Corriveau appeared in Havre-Saint-Pierre in March of 1969. She told her brother Sylvain that she had been living in a remote location on the North Shore, that she had needed a period of solitude that she had not known how to ask for, and that she was sorry for the grief her absence had caused. Sylvain accepted this because the only alternative was to disbelieve his sister, who was standing in his kitchen looking healthy and calm, and her presence alive before him was a fact that outweighed his questions about where she had been. She lived in Havre-Saint-Pierre for the rest of her life. She never married again. She became, in the years I knew her, a woman of very precise and quiet habits, someone who kept an orderly house and maintained a garden along the south-facing wall, and was known in her community for appearing without announcement at the homes of people who were in the middle of grief, bringing soup or a cord of split wood or simply her presence, sitting with people without requiring them to perform any version of improvement they were not actually feeling. We were friends, not intimate friends, not the way Madeleine and I were intimate, but the friends of people who share a knowledge they have never discussed, and whose friendship is held in the shape of that shared knowledge, without either of them ever needing to name it. We spoke perhaps once a year. She sent me a Christmas card every year until she died, in October of 2009, of a stroke, in her own house, in her sleep. The last card she sent me, in December of 2008, had a photograph of a winter forest on it. Black spruce heavily loaded with snow, the light coming through the canopy in that particular way it comes in December when the sun is low. She had written inside it only that she did not regret anything, that she found she never did. I have thought about those words for 16 years, in the particular way you think about words that are final, in ways you did not know they were final when they were written. I do not know with certainty what she intended by them. I know what I hope she intended, which is that the winter she spent in the limestone dark had given her something she was able to carry for the rest of her life, a warmth that did not require sunlight to sustain itself, a knowledge that she had been, at least once, in exactly the place she was supposed to be, doing exactly the thing that needed doing, regardless of what any official record said about it. I am 81 years old. I have not practiced nursing in 6 years. The provincial search and rescue unit I worked with for 22 years was reorganized twice after I left it, and I do not know what files from that era survive in any accessible form. There is no record anywhere that says we found anything in the karst terrain north of the Mekatina River in September of 1968, and the file for the disappearance of Vivienne Corriveau was closed and archived as an unresolved missing persons case, and it is, I expect, still filed under that category. Martine asked me whether it was true. It is true, all of it. Every detail I have given you. And I am giving it now because I am 81 years old, and the window for giving it is smaller than it was. And because Martine looks at the boreal forest with the same attention I brought to it at her age, the sense that it holds more than it shows, that the inventory of what lives in it is not complete and may never be complete. And I want her to know that a woman I respected went into the northern dark in the summer of 1968, carrying nothing but grief, and found something there that changed her. What she found was not something that can be named well by any word I have access to, and was not a hallucination, and was not a story assembled from need. It was a living thing of great age and great gentleness that had been keeping its own company in the limestone dark for longer than any of us could account for. And that found, in the last season of its life, or perhaps not the last season, the company of a woman who had also been keeping her own company too long, and between them they made something I have not been able to name in 56 years of trying, and have decided I do not need to name, because some things are true, or without requiring the right word attached to them. I am going to stop now. The device is on my kitchen table, and the window to the south is full of afternoon light, and outside in the garden, the late autumn asters are still open, pale and stubborn against the cold that is coming. And beyond the garden, the black spruce begin, and they go north for a very long way, and the limestone is under everything up there, under the thin soil and the root systems and the moss, riddled with passages, some of them mapped and most of them not. I find, I am glad, most of them are not.